I'm Andrew Rutledge, the Bentley's in-house historian, and I'm pleased to welcome you all tonight to the historic Judy and Stanley Frankel Detroit Observatory, a division of the Bentley. I also want to welcome our online audience on YouTube. Thank you all for joining us on what's really a beautiful fall evening to talk about a subject that happened on a tragic and very not beautiful fall evening 50 years ago. Tonight, our talk is about the tragic events of 50 years ago when the gales of November famously came early and sank the freighter Edmund Fitzgerald and took the lives of all 29 of its crew on Lake Superior. Immortalized in Gordon Lightfoot's famous song, which I'm not going to sing, the Fitzgerald is undoubtedly the most famous shipwreck in the Great Lakes and probably one of the most famous in American history. I even heard about it growing up in Southern California, and the Pacific's got all sorts of its own shipwrecks going on. But needless to say, when something like that happens, there are plenty of legends and myths that grow up about the ship and the crew. My own personal favorite involves aliens. But there are also more serious debates and theories about what happened that evening that have had all sorts of impacts on the history of Great Lakes shipping, histories of great industries that grow up around the Great Lakes, and the lives of those who sail on it. Our speaker tonight, Ric Mixter, is one of the few people that has actually visited the wreck site of the Edmund Fitzgerald, 550 feet below the surface. He's here to share with us the full story of the Edmund Fitzgerald, including its many connections to the University of Michigan and what his research has shown likely really happened that terrible night of November 10th, 1975. And there is no one better suited to discuss any Great Lakes shipwreck than Ric Mixter, who has been researching the Edmund Fitzgerald and other wrecks for decades. A diver and documentary maker, he has personally dived over 100 different shipwrecks in all of the Great Lakes. He's also hosted his own PBS series on diving, been a frequent guest on the Discovery and National Geographic channels, written dozens of articles about Great Lakes history. In 2009, was awarded the prestigious award for historic interpretation by the Association of Great Lakes Maritime History. Please join me in welcoming Ric Mixter.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you. Wow, with an intro like that, you're saying this is the luckiest youper you've ever seen, right? Super lucky, because in July, I actually had a brain tumor taken out of my head. So here's the busiest year that we're ever going to have on the Edmund Fitzgerald, and they're pulling a golf ball-sized tumor out of my head. And I'm looking at my wife going, am I going to be able to make all my arrangements, all my interviews? She's like, oh yeah, and I knew. She was kind of shaking her head. In 2 weeks, I was back to the tour schedule. I've already done 30 different cities, and I hope you can suffer through with this voice. 2 intubations to get that thing out. I am no cancer. It was a malignant, it just sat there and it pushed on my brain for 40 years. And I'm so lucky that I came out so good for it. So please forgive the voice. Thank you. Thank you. But really, truly, the luckiest youper in the world, because I've had eyewitness not only to the Edmund Fitzgerald. I flew the last missions of the Air Force bases on B-52s. I flew an F-16, the Goodyear blimp. I don't know how it all happens, because I was just this kid that was just interested in things and stories, and the history just seems to find me. The Fitzgerald, we lived through the storm in a trailer, 10 of us in a little tiny trailer where the epicenter of the storm came over in 1975. And I got to tell you, it wasn't that bad of a storm compared to the blizzard of 78. How many people remember that? Buried our trailer, we had to dig out. So I want to put this into perspective. And I really want to say, when all the PBS station, I just filmed with them 2 days ago. I filmed with Wisconsin. And they said, why are we still talking about the Edmund Fitzgerald 50 years later? And I have 2 words for them. It is my friend, Gordon Lightfoot. Now, as a disc jockey, I started at age 16 in the UP, very early start into professional broadcasting. We love songs that are 6 minutes long for bathroom breaks, right? Beatles songs don't work. 2-minute songs are not enough time. We love these long songs, and for me as a junior historian, I got A's in history. I could not get math. I got D's in math, but history was just something I could grasp. And this song came out. I realized Bye Bye Miss American Pie, the second longest song that I've ever been on the radio. Here's another history song about another tragedy, a plane crash that took our pop stars too. So this one really is big. I'm gonna pick on Gordon a little bit tonight. I have to, because if this is your only idea about our maritime history, there's so many inaccuracies in there, and I have to correct them. And everybody always tells me, Rick, it's not a documentary, it's a song. My point is, Gordon changed the lyrics because he saw a documentary and he changed them incorrectly. He could have fixed it, so we'll talk about that in a minute. Let's start with not the first Edmund Fitzgerald to sink. He had an uncle, the one that we know about, built schooners in Port Huron, and he built one called the E. Fitzgerald. And in a tragic November gale, 1883, it sinks off Long Point. The guys from the life-saving service show up, and they get there and they find nobody except that overturned lifeboat that you see. The cook was found the next season. Just a real tragedy for Edmund Fitzgerald, who built some of the most famous ships on the Great Lakes. It had another one sink too in a horrible collision, the Carlingford. But that's a whole other lecture if you want to talk about him. We really want to talk about this guy. Here's a guy whose dad was in charge of the Milwaukee dry dock. So not only grandpa captain, uncle's captain, but this guy gets out and goes into the business world. What's the connection between Great Lakes and the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company? Well, if you have an insurance company and it's as big as this one actually paid out, by the way, for the wreck of the Titanic. They paid more claims than any other insurance company, and it was 13 people, including some millionaires from Minnesota. There was almost $500,000 in claims that came out of there. How do they do it, though? They have to have investments. When you put in your policy money, you ask for $1 million if you should, or lose a family member that should pass away. It works out because they save up billions. It was $3.5 billion by the time they hit their century mark. And when Edmund Fitzgerald went from president to the first chairman of the board at Northwest Mutual, they had to find good investments. Real estate, ships, over 100 barges on the Mississippi. They owned 3 ships on the Great Lakes, and they realized that the ore industry was so powerful that they even got into a pelletizing plant. Now, what's pelletizing about? Well, for those of you not from the UP, most of the high-grade iron ore had been taken out of the ground, especially from Minnesota, but a lot of it from the Negaunee Range and going to the Marquette docks, Escanaba docks. Most of that was gone by World War II. That need for steel was so incredible that all they really had left was taconite, a magnetic ore. And there was a professor at the University of Minnesota that figured out a way to crush the silica, run a magnet over the top of it, and all that ore would jump up. The iron would come up, and they'd roll it in bentonite clay to make a pellet so they could easily transport it in train cars that had V bottoms. And then it would go up into these giant bridges, these pocket docks, the ore docks that you're so familiar with, and it would pour gravity-fed into the ships. It's also perfect for pouring into furnaces, and that bentonite clay actually works as a flux to make steel. So a great way to do it. Once they process it, now it's 65% iron, a perfect product to carry along. And for those of us from the UP, the greatest slingshot ammunition you've ever seen. For a wrist rocket, we could load up our pockets and have all the stuff we wanted to cause mayhem across the streets of Gwyn. Here's where they're going to invest. So Northwestern, not only looking at shipping, but they're also looking at the possibility of this new plant. Reserve Mining decides to take this, just a hole in the ground where the beavers and the mosquitoes lived, and they're going to carve out a city right there. And this city would become a whole place just to process these taconite pellets. And then they said, why don't we build the biggest ship to carry those pellets? But when it first came into the newspapers, believe it or not, this was a huge deal for our friends in Michigan. We were at really the tail end of 200 years of building ships on the Detroit River, starting with the British before we were even the United States of America, going all the way into Great Lakes Engineering Works, where these guys had built 300 other ships. Hull 299 was the William Clay Ford. So how many people have been to Dawson Museum? Oh, we're going to promise we're going to go, right? Go to Belle Island and go into the pilot house, and that's one of the ships that searched for the Edmund Fitzgerald. So you could go right onto a pilot house that looks just like the Fitz, and so historic in the fact that you can actually see the wear marks that Captain Erickson put on the machinery, put his foot up on the radar. So it's a very cool place to visit. So 5 years since the building of the Clay Ford, these guys get word that 3 new freighters are coming. Everybody in Michigan celebrates because now we have 3 giant maximum class Lakers coming through. But the first marks that were coming through didn't really go to Great Lakes Engineering Works. It came here to Ann Arbor. Here's a good aerial. This was taken 2 weeks ago, by the way, by the Coast Guard when they flew our Homeland Security Director across. And you can see Ambassador Bridge. You can see the brand new Gordie Howe. I can't wait to cross that. Zug Island. Now Gordon sings in the song, fully loaded for Cleveland, right? No. Partially loaded because it was in the fall and not going to Cleveland. It was going to Detroit, to Zug Island in particular, so closer to River Rouge. And just past there, look at the arrow. That's Great Lakes Engineering Works. So all of this is just in a really quick stretch. And even Fitzgerald's dad had a ship named for him at Wyandotte. So not even 5 more miles down, you have the incredible shipbuilding mecca that was coming out of Wyandotte. So they built the big palatial steamers that you see. And even if you go to the museum at Belle Isle, you can see some of that work as well. So here's where the announcement comes out. And the first plans that come to U of M, the Department of Naval Engineering here, they call it NAME, actually got the first plans to look at the length of the ship, which would be maximum class. And you see in the beginning, I put it in yellow. It says a Canadian ore freighter. Like, wait a minute, where does that come from? The Seaway was being built. And at the time, Northwest Mutual was just looking for a ship that they could really economize. And because the Seaway was going to go to 730 foot, they said, we're going to build a ship that can handle that. So that if the Fitzgerald had to, it could go to salt water and keep working. But they got a better charter with reserve mining, with Ogilvy Norton. They got a great charter, a great company to work with, and 85% of the trips were going to be from really the reserve mining and go all the way to Toledo. That's why she became known as the Toledo Express. So naval architecture right here, Bear, famous for the longer ships and for the vacation land, if you remember that from the ferry at the Straits of Mackinac. But he worked on several ships, the Ryerson, the Munson, the Callaway, and he also helped fix another famous ship. So anybody who knows about the Carl D. Bradley, second largest ship lost on the Great Lakes, he actually figured out a way because the Bradley had this really weird shake in the back. In fact, the cook said that the plates would shake right off the table because of the way this thing vibrated. And Bear came out and actually designed this weird fin that came over the propeller and straightened it out. And it was a good deal, but sadly, 2 of the ships that he'd work on would become the most famous or infamous, I guess, on the Great Lakes. And it's interesting, in his obit, they cut the Fitzgerald and the Bradley out of there. They put all the other ships on there, but I think I can understand why. How big was it going to be? Maximum class had everybody at the Sulaks nervous. 729 feet, you could not close the gates. And they were very nervous about this bigger ship and talked that the Homer was going to be a foot longer than the Fitzgerald. So everybody at the locks were nervous. Let's put it into perspective, though. Titanic, 883 feet long. The Mayflower, you could put the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, and if you wanted the ironclad Monitor right on deck of the Edmund Fitzgerald and still have room left over. Capable of 30,000 tons. In U.S. steel, if you look around 1975, our cars were mostly made out of metal. That's over 2,000 automobiles that could be built. That's pretty incredible in one load. That's an average car dealership in 75 was doing 1,000 cars. So think about a ship that could deliver that much steel in one run. A lot of people were excited about it. This is another U of M guy. This is Willett Spooner. And I actually didn't find this picture going through his collection, but you're going to find out why I love Bentley Library so much. They had the greatest construction footage I've ever seen on the Edmund Fitzgerald, but nobody knew it. It was listed as GLEW 301, and when I asked them to process it, they said, well, what is it? And I'm a little sneaky. I said, don't you worry, it's nothing. They called up and they said, hey, we watched the launch footage of the Edmund Fitzgerald. I said, listen, it's the 20th anniversary. I'm making a documentary. Please don't call Channel 7 and 4 and tell them, that you have this. And of course, it's their footage. They can do whatever they want. But we've had a wonderful partnership since. Willett Spooner is the guy that carried the camera. He was one of the engineering guys from your naval school here. And Willett Spooner's wife was even more famous. If you type in Spooner, she was famous for being in the Women's League of Voters and so many other things around Ann Arbor, which was amazing. And in the collection of hers are all the love letters between Will and her. So I get to go through his nickname for her was Snooky. And you don't get that kind of background, on something like this. And I know I'm going way off on a tangent here, but I'm telling you, these stories and the research is almost as much fun as putting your dry suit on and diving into the water. I spend more time in libraries than I ever spend underwater, and that's by design because we have to figure this out. So Snooky and Will went all around the world, 50 countries on their sailboat. It was an incredible love affair, and I'm thrilled to say that she also was involved in the top secret program of building the first Bomark missile, anti-bomber defense missile that was built out at Willow Run. Another lecture, another day, okay? So here's the magic of Spooner. He stands there during the keel laying. This is the backbone of the ship. That long piece of metal is the keel. I'm going to refer to this many times because many people believe this is why it sank. It had problems with the way it flexed. Every ship flexes in storms. The Bradley would flex, but after November it was so brittle it ripped in half in 1958. 2 survivors. In 1966, pre-World War SEAL, 1906 launched Daniel J. Morrell. Rips in half, the stern keeps going for 5 more miles, the bow sinks, one guy in his underwear survives 2 nights on a life raft. That's why I'm so excited about these shipwrecks, these incredible survivals. The Fitzgerald is a tragedy in which 29 people were lost. But these stories, the building, the sailors that were there, the rescue people are what really makes me excited about it, not about the loss. I'm a television reporter with over 30 years of covering fires and tragedies. That part does not excite me. Bodies on shipwrecks does not make me happy, regardless of what you might have seen when our discovery of the crewman came through. Let's watch the footage. Here's the first plate coming down. Hull 301, this is marking a brand new renaissance in building for the next 4 years. 5 years it took to build this, and they launched it in subsections, which was new for the yard. That whole section had 3 companies building these pieces, and that would be part of the cargo hold on the right. They're all individually launched, and then the gantry crane will pick them up, put them on the keel, and weld it down using a production weld. 4 times faster than they built the William Clay Ford. 2 months earlier, they turned the ship out. And a lot of people were worried about the construction. But that'll be the ballast on the bottom. On the top, you can actually see where the tunnel is, where the people can travel to and from the end of the ship without going on deck, which is important. Watertight bulkhead, only 2 at the front and the aft of the ship. The midsections only had screens, so the water could go cargo hold to cargo hold, but couldn't go further than that. Get over here so we don't get wet. In we go. Big splash. They say 15,000 people were here. I don't buy it. I count maybe 5,000 in the audience. I think it was exaggerated. Now, maybe some were hiding in other places. I don't know. But one guy who got the best seat in the entire house was Ed Domansky. His dad was the chief welder. His job was a chipper. He would check the welds to make sure they were good. He even said they x-rayed the welds to make sure that they were solid. He said men and women would be sailing on this. We wanted to make sure this was a good boat. But he rowed the ship into the water for a very specific reason.
That's me over here at the stanchion here. When that thing went in, it tipped over and headed toward the water, and I had a death grip on that. And they were talking about that double bottom. The reason I was on that thing when it was launched, the rest of these guys and I, our job, they gave us a flashlight and some chalk. And I found out after we got in the water, I said, what do we do now? He says, now we go down at the bottom, in those double bottoms, which is just the keel plates below the water. And he says, you listen for running water in case there's it hits the far side and springs a leak. I says, if you hear running water, you're going to hear running feet. But That's how I got to be on the Fitz when it went in.
I was so lucky I was able to interview 3 different guys that built the ship. It's all in my documentary, and that will be airing on PBS, plus we have copies here as well. On the flip side of the disc has Final Run, my program with the survivors of 1913, 1940 storm. It's one-of-a-kind interviews and storm footage from these as well. That it took 30 years to find all this stuff. Here's a good launch picture. Here's a great cross-section to show you the 3 different holds that hold about 10,000 tons of pellets in each one. So in their best days in the summer, they could carry maximum cargo, 30,000 tons. They start breaking records at the Soo Locks immediately because they're the biggest boat on the Great Lakes. Now, when they come back, typically a ship will try to grab another cargo, like coal, take it up to the power plants in Marquette. But the Fitzgerald was so fast, it could almost do 16 miles an hour. It didn't make sense to slow down at Marquette when it could come back, get more cargo, and go back and forth from Toledo, maximize the amount of money that they transfer over. So in order to come back, you have to pump your ship full of water. That sounds crazy, but that's what we call ballast. And every one of these tanks, and there's 16 of them all the way around the ship, and this is a cross-section to show you how they go. And they're all filled with a little bit more in the back to make sure that propeller and that rudder is down in the water so it can do its job effectively. So pump it full of water, you get to the dock, and then there's this beautiful ballet. Water gets pumped out or gets dropped in, and I'll show you that process in a minute. If you put water in a tank, though, the air has to go somewhere. You have to have a vent to allow that air to escape, and you have to have a vent that you can close so that nothing else will come in when you get into heavy weather. It had many vents on the deck that went all the way across, and these right here on the bottom, and on this side right here, these are the ballast vents. They look like mushroom caps. So the crew would open them up like this, and then they would let the air out. They'd fill the tanks. They'd bring it all the way down, shut it and lock it, and away they'd go. Now, when the government told them you could extend, because they requested they could haul more cargo in the wintertime. In order to do that, they said, well, your hatches all have to be secure, and your vents have to be extended above the deck. They're trying to keep, if you're lower in the water, the freeboard of your deck all the way down to the waves, they're trying to keep that water out. So by bringing those vents higher, it would help. The problem is the vents were a trip hazard on deck. So they said, well, we'll lengthen a couple of them, and then they made the modification to allow them to carry more cargo. So now she's carrying more cargo than she was designed for. In '72, they put bow thrusters in the front. They added 10 tons of more equipment on the front. And then when the EPA started yelling at them for burning coal, they switched over to oil, and that also added some new machinery as well. So a lot of stuff out of design, but commonplace for many of the ships on the Great Lakes. These vents are going to be important because those 8-inch pipes that come down, McSorley, the captain, is going to say, I've had damage on deck. My vents are missing. He doesn't say how many. Cooper says 2, but in all the Coast Guard reports, they don't know how many, but it's plural. 2 8-inch openings with Lake Superior pouring in, and they're trying to pump it out. And you've got 21 hatches on deck, all that have the possibility of water coming in, and big arguments to me from sailors that say they would never sail with those hatches all off. We'll talk about that. Here's the last season for the Fitzgerald. Overall, 740 trips that she made, going from the upper reaches of Superior and especially Silver Bay, all the way down Lake Huron, on gales on each of the lakes. And in this last season, you see the dots are representing 1975 alone. You can see 4 trips to Detroit. You can see most of our trips with a 27,000-ton load going into Toledo as the maximum on 11 July, and even Indiana Harbor. So she had some miles behind her for sure. Paid off $8 million, the investment to a life insurance company, paid off in full. And tragically, in their charter, it actually meant that they would get money if the ship sank as well. So the Northwestern Mutual did not lose on the Edmund Fitzgerald. Here's footage from Captain Larson. His family gave me this footage of them pouring it in. Now, this is the only dock that they had a manual for how to load the ship using this conveyor system. And the first mate, who was actually on the Fitzgerald, was another captain. McCarthy was actually a captain on board the Tate. He transferred over to the Fitzgerald after he had an accident. Loved the Fitzgerald. It had air conditioning. It was outfitted by Hudson's. Everybody loved that ship. All the mucky mucks and the steel companies would come on board there for the rides that they would take to be, wined and dined by the best cook in the fleet, best captain supposedly. And so the Fitzgerald was a special boat. And they ran her hard. Every one of these captains saw gales, every one, and it got progressively worse. And as we see these gales happening, we start to realize that that keel is coming loose. And there's been a couple times the Coast Guard were told that they had to do repairs. Look at this early storm. This would be 2 captains before McSorley. They were taking on some pretty serious weather here as they go into the storm, and they're carrying a full load of iron ore onto Lake Superior. The wheelman had been on since 1959, John Simmons. He would watch for Whitefish Point. Has anybody been to Whitefish Point? Excellent. And I'm on the board of directors at the museum there. I'm thrilled if you go to see the bell. We'd love to have you up there. He'd see Whitefish Point, and he'd say welcoming point is what he called it. It welcomed them into the safety of Whitefish Bay, and that's what he called it. Fitzgerald would go through the Soo Locks, and they were breaking records, and all of a sudden the Homer came out. It was longer. It took a record. Then the Sykes came out. It was bigger. It took a record. And after a while, it was like, how is Fitzgerald still carrying more cargo with these other bigger ships? I asked the cook, and he goes, well, Captain Pulser would go in and cheat on fuel. So if you get to the Soo Locks, they measure to see on your plimsoll marks how low in the water you are. If you carry more cargo than you're supposed to, in the fall especially, they'll fine you. So this guy cheats on fuel, waits till he gets to the Soo Locks and refuels and gets a full load. Now the cook goes, that's a great idea until you get stalled on Superior in a storm. Then what do you do when you run out of fuel? He goes, you can't just throw a chair into the boiler and make it run when you're burning gas or oil. So bunker C fuel was very exclusive there, and you can't just pull up to a gas station to get it, right? But they were breaking records. They were the first to haul 1 million tons in a year, even though there were bigger ships on the lakes than them. This is Captain Pulser, famous, the guy that would play music as he went through the Soo Locks. Everybody loved when he'd come through the ports, and he'd always talk to people. I had somebody come to my talk in Grosse Pointe yesterday that had pictures of him and Pulser, and he said the guy just was amazing. He'd come through and honk the horn even at 2 o'clock in the morning because he knew the kid was there. So just a thrill that people would love this boat, and it was such a frequent customer coming through. People ask me, they say, Rick, I've got a picture of the Edmund Fitzgerald to Soo Locks. How much is it worth? I said, well, she came through 750 times. I'm sure there's a lot of pictures, but some of the pictures are special. By the way, look at this. He gets his award. He calls up Un at the locks and says, I think I've got another record. And he said, well, how did it happen? Look at the quote at the bottom. Well, the loading signal for stopping was delayed, and we added 300 tons more. So here he is again putting more cargo than he's supposed to and heading out, and they're giving him an award for it. As we get into the next captain, McSorley, they had a big thing in the Weather Bureau bulletin that said windbreaker. It said for 2 years in a row, the Edmund Fitzgerald took on more storms than any other ship, and they were talking like this was great. Well, it is great for the steel companies, but I got to tell you, don't blame the steel companies, because nobody in that steel company wants an $8 million ship and then 29 guys that are highly trained, one of the most highly trained crews on the Great Lakes, to disappear for a cargo full of rocks. Nobody. You can read all the books you want about the greedy guy that looks like Mr. Burns from Simpsons going, excellent, But of course it was good news when he came through, but we'll hear about that mentality from the captains of why they keep pushing through in a minute. There was problems at Silver Bay. They were dumping all of their tailings, the waste silica, into Lake Superior, figuring it's just rock. And people were getting sick in Duluth. So they a judge shut down Silver Bay, the whole town, said you're not making any more cargo for a week. And of course they said you can't do that, this is all we have. So they finally came up with a plan to put out ponds where they could throw the tailings in. But there was some question as to whether or not it'd be open or not. So Fitzgerald and Ogilvy Norton was looking at different places to load. And 4 times they went to this dock, but so infrequently that the guy that loaded the Fitzgerald said he'd never seen the ship before. So it comes into this dock, once the highest, tallest docks in the world. 17 ships used to be able to load here at one time. Fitzgerald was so long, it had to fill half of its hatches and then move 12 feet to fill the rest of them. That's how big Fitzgerald was. Also, Gordon says, where did he say it was coming from? Some mill in Wisconsin. There's no mill in Wisconsin. There's never been a taconite mill in Wisconsin. So it came from Duluth at 80 miles into Duluth up here. Butler and National Pellet is up there, and they'd cart it all the way down to the dock and they'd stockpile it. Sometimes it would still be steaming if it came out of the plant. That's how hot these pellets are. And they absorb water too as well, which would be a problem as well. So they get in, they go to these chutes, and the guy lowers the chute down, and he can raise and lower it. It's a little less accurate than the conveyor system at Silver Bay, but here it works. And McCarthy, the captain, he'd be the first mate, but he's a captain. He'd sit on deck, and he'd watch these lights and see if it was loaded correctly. So if it's too much on one side, the light would go on, and he'd back it off. More in the back so the propeller could do its job. And when it's perfectly trimmed, then they'd get going. And as they pulled out, Captain Paquette on board the Sykes said all their hatches weren't dogged down yet, which it's a long job. It's a beautiful day. We find out now that the old cook wasn't on board the ship when it went down. The old cook had gotten off. He had bone spurs on his feet. Red Bergner was in Texas when the ship went down. I had the option to go on this ride, but he told him, no, I'm going to stay home. And he said that definitely the loading was an issue with this ship, that the unloaders at Detroit had beaten up several hatches. They were having problems, and the Coast Guard showed that some of them were leaking. They were problematic. They had to be fixed that winter, so more water could have been coming in there as well. And he talked about a captain that really, really pushed on the ship, and that overtime was outlawed. No overtime in the galley, no overtime on deck. So when they left on a Sunday, they only dogged down the corners and in the midsections and left most of the clamps still hanging there. Now, how do we know that to be true? We know that because underwater we can see which hatches are damaged and which ones aren't. We'll show you that in a minute. This is the smoking gun on the Edmund Fitzgerald. Gordon changed his song to say the main hatchway did not give in. I guarantee you this hatch in hatch number 6 gave in. This is why the Edmund Fitzgerald was put under. She was slowly gaining water. She was lower in the water. She had a keel problem. And when a wave almost 3 stories tall hit the ship, it collapsed this hatch. And those clamps weren't on tight enough. And that ship, it folded that clamp right in. So we'll show you. Those are called Kessner clamps. They look like C-clamps, and they're hinged on deck. Mark Kessner and his brother out of Cleveland invented these things. And there's 68 of them, so it was a lot of overtime to do it. McCarthy was a captain, as I mentioned. He could have ordered it to be done, but he wasn't going to supersede McSorley, who was trying to cut costs as well. So I don't believe that all those hatches were dogged down. They leave, there's small craft warnings, there's gale warnings. As the storm comes up from Oklahoma, they know it's intensifying. As it makes the hook and start heading for the Great Lakes, they're judging how fast will it go to Marquette. And more importantly, how long will it take to jump over Lake Superior? Why is that important? That's the Anderson. The Anderson will be following them into the storm. So they go up by Devil's Island. This is where they have radio beacons. You can see I have lighthouse towers and then radio beacons. They use radio navigation to find their way through the storm. So when you hear about radars going out, they really didn't use radar that much. It was more for separation of other ships. The beacons that were on here were more of their navigation. Now, they certainly did use radar, but to pretend that they were blind in the storm is a little silly. So turn at Devils, they have to make a decision. Do we take the normal route, the yellow route, shortcut going down to Welcome Point here at Whitefish, or with the storm building, how long will it take to go here to here? And the question is, mostly they would think that would be 3 hours that would take. Well, it took less than 2 hours to do that. So it went faster than the meteorologists thought it would. It went faster than the captains did. And they decided, as they're coming up here, where all those ships were hiding, Blau was hiding up here on November 10th. Ryerson was up in here in Thunder Bay, hiding out of the storm. 7 vessels were down here at anchor. They weren't going to take on the storm, but Anderson and Fitzgerald did. And we'll find out from the captain why they challenged this storm, why it happened from Captain Cooper. So they take a northern route to minimize the waves building. As out of the northeast, you need fetch. You need distance to build those waves. And if you stay up towards the top, you're not going to get as big of waves. And as you go up here, you can go to the very top of the lake and hide behind the Slate Islands if you have to. When Jacques Cousteau came to the Great Lakes, that's where he hid when a storm hit early on Lake Superior. So Slate Islands was an option. They could also hide behind Michipicoten, which is down here. And then as they came across at 1 o'clock, they got to right off of Otterhead. In fact, the guys at the lighthouse right over here saw the Fitzgerald. Anderson was still 20 miles behind them. And so Anderson starts to cut the corner as they make the turn to go past Michipicoten. Now they're starting to go for the beacon at the west end of Michipicoten. And they're going to look for the lighthouse as well. But snow's starting to build. They're at the eye of the storm. It passed Marquette where it hit its peak pressure, or low pressure, starting to come up. And as they get up to there, they realize they're in the eye of the storm. They totally misguessed on how long, and now they have no options on where to go. They've got to sail between the two islands and get down to Whitefish. So they start pressing on, and as the winds now go past, the low front goes past here, now the direction of counterclockwise flow of the winds are now going to build out of here and build straight down here. Look at the fetch, all the way down here. Peak 65 knots, 75 gusts, but 65 it's pushing, waves that are now almost 3 stories tall. So they're pushing down there, and this is where the Fitz is going. Anderson had been lengthened by 85 feet that summer. So it was 13 knots or 13 miles an hour was the maximum speed. It was always behind Fitzgerald. And that's why Fitzgerald kept pushing until they got by Caribou. But we start hearing about some problems. Here comes a low pressure system. I'll throw a little plug in for Ric's house right here in Sands, Michigan, right about a mile from K.I. Sawyer Air Force Base where I was born. That goes over our house, and we remember the winds. It pushed over a trailer in the Sioux. But no other real damage other than that. The Fitzgerald was really the only casualty. As it goes past, you see it starting to build again as it gets past Marathon. But unfortunately, these guys are just now starting to come past here, and they start to make some observations. Let's talk about 75. How many storms did Fitzgerald see in 75? The yellow mark is from the Weather Bureau. I put in from the Weather Bureau's reports. This is the ships that received the biggest waves in 1975. Top box is just Lake Superior. Fitzgerald overwhelmingly took on more storms, more damage to that keel as they're moving along. The only time the Coast Guard checks them is in the spring, and then they usually do a deck check in October. And in the spring, they didn't mention any problems below. But these are all opportunities of gale force winds that are going to bust the Fitzgerald up. And now she's going into a killer gale that would be the worst one. In April, you see the Fitzgerald going through another gale on Lake Huron. McSorley never missed a fight. In fact, I talked to his crew members about it, and I said, what was it like sailing with this guy? This is the old cook. This is Red Bergner. And he said, he almost killed me.
McSorley was a rough weather skipper. He wouldn't haul up for nothing. You know, we're going through. He says, we don't make no money sitting at anchor. You know? Okay. I called the office once, told them after we came in on a blow, I said, Fred and Phil and I sat on a fantail out there all night long. Why? I says, put this on record. This son of a bitch is going to sink us. You're kidding. I says, hell no. I says, I'm up on the top deck. And I said, we had water coming over the top deck. I says, smashing in the lifeboats and everything. I says, that's bullshit. And I said, if we could have, we'd have popped one of the pills on that life raft and sat right there and waited for her to go down. Well, Bob says it's a good thing you didn't, because he says it'd have cost you $500.
So imagine this, you call your boss, you blow the whistle to say this captain is going to kill us, and they say if you accidentally launch a rubber life raft, we're going to bill you. So this is the response they're getting, not, hey, McSorley, be a little safer out there. He keeps pushing because they're still getting cargo through, and it's good news for them. But we're going to have problems now. 1 o'clock, the Fitzgerald is well ahead of the Anderson. Anderson cuts the corner. They make the wind, see them coming out of the northeast right now. As they make the turn and go down past Mishapacotton towards Caribou, the winds now come out of the northwest, and they're starting to build. So they're now getting 12-foot waves as they approach Caribou. And at Caribou, just before it, the Fitzgerald calls the Anderson and says, I've got some damage. I have a rail down, and there's some conflict between the first mate who heard the message as well. He said, I thought he said it was gone. So it was the difference between is the railing, the fence, the wire that's on the side of the ship that keeps you from falling overboard, is that in the water or is it gone? And then he says, I have vents missing and water coming into the ship. And this is what he tells Cooper.
Well, he called me up. That was 3:10 in the afternoon. And he said, I've got a little problem. He said, my fence rail is down. He said, I've got 2 vents missing, and I've taken a starboard list. Now, an immediate list, again, tells me that he either had a stress fracture or he bottomed out. He said he had his pumps on. I asked him if he had his pumps on. He said yes. But he said later on, he said that he wasn't gaining anything by pumping out on it, so the water was coming in the hull as fast as they were pumping it out. And those were 2 big pumps that he had on there. So the fracture or the stress fracture or him bottoming out had to happen at that time. And from that time on, he was sinking. The water would get into these side tanks, and if his side tanks were not tight, watertight, the water would start leaking through them into the cargo hold, into the pellets. And there's no way of getting the water out of the cargo hold with the pellets in there. You can't get it out. So it would be a gradual process of water going in there, creating a deeper and deeper draft forward.
So Cooper looks at the radar, sees a Fitzgerald, he goes, wow, she's closer in there than I thought she should be. He then goes and takes a nap. So does he really believe it ran aground? No. He looked at it, he says, boy, she's closer in there than I want to be. The mate later debates that they were even close to there. But during the investigation, they look at this and they say, well, what is this 6-fathom shoal? So they go in and they send the Canadian survey ship Bayfield in there to search the entire area. It turns out it's 10 fathoms deep. It's not a shoal. And after 30 plus years of researching, no other ship has ever sunk on Chummy Bank, all right? There's no secret shoal out there or anything. But this becomes this incredible myth that the Edmund Fitzgerald ran aground. Why did it gain so much amazing attention? Well, first, it was from Cooper, the hero that turned around in the storm. Secondly, this is the greatest excuse for any shipping company. Captain hits the rock, captain dies, end of story, you can't sue us. And they were only held to the liability of the price of the Fitz, $8 million in the cargo. But if they can prove the hatches were the problem, that they didn't jog them all down, that it was an overtime call by the company, now it can become the $10 million lawsuit that was first announced. So this is why you see everybody jump on this theory, even the myth that somebody found a rock. Dick Race was paid by the shipping company, by Ogilvy Norton, to go find a rock, and he later told his buddies, I secretly found a rock, but I was too nervous to tell anybody about it. This is a guy that stole things off shipwrecks. He doesn't care about what the Coast Guard says. He took the wheel off the Cedarville and so many other ships to pretend that Dick Race ever found this rock, which would exonerate in the shipping company. This would have been the holy grail for them to hold up and say, I told you, it has red paint on it. It's from the Fitzgerald. It ran aground. It never existed. Trust me on that. Here's the Coast Guard said it would have taken a half hour to go these 5 miles to cross this distance to even get close to where that shoal was. Bayfield said it didn't even exist. And as you go through this area right in through here, they would have been way off course for what the Fitzgerald was found on. So it doesn't make any sense. The architect said if it hit Caribou Shoal, it would have sank at Caribou Shoal. It did not have watertight bulkheads in the middle. So nobody agrees with Cooper on the entire process here. So here we go through 8, we see the 3:30 damage. Now we look at the 4 o'clock. He calls out and he says, listen, I see the traffic coming out of the bottom. Look at the very tip of Whitefish Point here and here. Those little dots represent the ships. The 3 at the top are the Aberforths, the Nanfree, and the Benfree, all saltwater ships with foreign captains, but they have pilots that are captains from the U.S. and Canada on board. I think they were all American pilots that were on board. Those guys are going for it. The reason the Fitz and the Anderson weren't so nervous and the 3 saltwater ships weren't was because a wave at your bow or a wave at your stern is no big deal. They think that's normal. The song goes, it was too rough to feed you. Everybody ate their meals on board the Anderson. It was now 10 miles behind the Edmund Fitzgerald. They said the egg wouldn't even roll off the table. They were not rolling violently in the storm at all. They had a stern sea as they went up, but it was going to get messy because we had a big wave at 6 o'clock hit the Anderson, and it jumped over their smokestack and destroyed their lifeboat. It had to be 30 feet high to do that. And it's going past the Anderson. It's moving faster than the 13 mile an hour Anderson. So it's racing ahead of them. Cooper's down below. He's taking his nap. Mate starts talking to the Fitz. The Fitz says, hey, am I going to clear those guys down there? And he goes, yeah. He goes, it shouldn't be any problem. Now blinding snow. He can't see anything because his radar's gone. They can't see anything with binoculars because the snow is so heavy. And then Cooper finally comes back onto the deck. And this is when the mate asks, how are you doing with your problems? And McSorley says, we're holding our own. They believe they're going to make that 17 miles to the Whitefish Bay. Once they get behind this big point, they're going to have safety away from those winds that are coming down. So get below Whitefish, get into the bay where the Frontenac, the Marjane, and the William Clay Ford, the Roush are all sitting there, and you'll be safe. And unfortunately, they don't make it because that wave comes up after that broadcast, and crushes in those hatches, and 29 guys vanish. I mentioned 58, 1966, the Morel, the Bradley. They found most of the crew. They had survivors from the ship, but in 1975, with rubber life rafts, the most advanced radio systems, even a satellite flying in the sky at the time, and they lost 29 people like that without an SOS. And that's what led to this entire mystery, and why Newsweek wrote an article about it, and why Gordon read Newsweek and wrote the song about it. It was the mystery of the ship disappearing. So here's a great drawing. Mark Conklin did this for us for the museum. It's taking a nosedive. I don't believe the Fitzgerald nosedived, and we'll talk why that's not possible, but it's a very photogenic picture, and it's called Every Man Knew. And that's a lyric from Gordon. Did the crew know what was happening? And Captain Cooper said, well, we probably wouldn't have said anything.
You just can't panic the crew. You got to keep your mouth shut. You got to work around that somehow. And I like every other captain, I think you think your ship is infallible. I think he thought that ship was going to get him down. I know I thought that way about the Anderson. I didn't think anything. I thought she was indestructible. But I think Captain McSorley felt the same way. You know, he said, well, I'm only 14 miles from Whitefish Point. He said, I've got it made. That's just about what he would be saying. But his last alternative before that was to go in and put her aground at Caribou. That would have been his only other alternative at the time, and he probably would have if he knew what was going to happen.
Best interview I've ever heard on the Fitzgerald. I thought my ship was infallible, and that's what these captains believed. McSorley knew about hulls. He was a hull inspector for the early part of his career. He trusted the Fitzgerald, but he knew there were problems. The cook told me that the engineer came up and said, Skipper, we've got problems down below again. And this is what McSorley told him. He said, it only has to hold together for a couple more months and I'm retiring. That's what he told him. So you want to blame the storm all you want. Of course it was the wave that put the Fitzgerald down, but it's hard not to point your finger at a guy that ran that ship literally into the lake. Anderson starts calling when they realize, they look out, the snow squall is blinding by 7:15, but by 7:30 it's crystal clear. They can see Coppermine Point, they can see the saltwater vessel lights, they don't see the Fitzgerald on radar or through binoculars. So they start calling the other ships. They're trying to get the Coast Guard, but there's a half-hour delay because of a power failure that shut off the lighthouse at Whitefish. So the beacon also goes off and the relay doesn't transfer over to go to generator. So now Fitzgerald really didn't have any help at that point, but now it's on the bottom. It's 550 feet on the bottom and no time to call for help at all. Anderson gets below the point. Woo, we made it, but they're calling for help. The Coast Guard says, well, we're going to send out our tug. So the Naugatuck tries to leave the locks, but has oil problems and has to turn around. World War II was built in 32 or 33 out of Defoe. It shouldn't be out there, quite frankly, although it had been through big storms before. Naugatuck turns around, they call Woodrush, 20 hours away. So they need somebody closer. Airplanes launch out of Cherry Capital, out of the air station. So we get albatrosses and choppers out there, but we need somebody on the water. So they call the Salties. Remember, Cooper's way down here. Salties are right next to where the Fitzgerald went down. And the American captains asked the saltwater skippers, will you turn around? They said, no, we'll flip our ships over in this gale. We're going straight. We'll keep our eyes open, but we're not going to stop. They call the other ships down there. The Roush says, no, I will not hazard my crew to go out there. Before you pass any judgment, the captain's first responsibility is his crew. He's not supposed to be the Coast Guard. He's not on a cutter. He's on a freighter. And all these guys, even on board Erickson on board the William Clay Ford, are like, hey, we don't know. Finally, the Clay Ford hears a transmission, and this is the transmission that changes his mind about going back out.
Anderson, Group 2, 16, 22. Around 22. Anderson, this is Group 2. Roger, sir. This is Group 2. I understand you had him visually and on the radar, and you lost him in both respects. I asked him how he was making out with his problem. He said he lost those vents and he had a lift, and he said he was holding his own. The last time I talked with him, he said he was holding his own, and that's the last time I lost contact after that. This is Super Control, Roger. We have it. Do you think there's any possibility that you could come about and go back there and do any searching? Over. Well, God, I don't know. The sea out there is tremendously large, and if you want me to, I can, but I'm not going to be making any time. I'll be lucky to make 2 or 3 miles an hour going back out that way. Hello, Two-Control. You realize what the conditions are out there, don't you? It's Two-Control. Affirmative. From what you report, I can appreciate the conditions. Again, though, I have to leave that decision up to you as to whether you'll be hazarding your vessel or not. If you think you can safely go back into the area, I would request that you do so, but I have to leave that decision up to you. Over. Well, I'll go out and take a look, but I know when I was about 15 miles above Whitefish, we took a sea right over the top of the hatch crane up there, and that's 8 feet up in the water, too, so I don't know whether I can do it or not. I'll give it a try, but that's all I can do.
Cooper tells him 8 feet of water on his deck. The NTSB, who also investigates with the Coast Guard, says 4 feet of water would collapse those hatches. And they have 8 feet. And the Anderson is actually 6 to 8 feet higher in the water because it's not taking water like the Fitzgerald. So the Anderson didn't sink because it didn't have the damage, it didn't have the water coming in, and it was much bigger than the Fitzgerald. This is all that they found. Cooper found a half a lifeboat, they left it, and the Roush eventually picked it up after they dropped their cargo in Marquette. They came back with this boat. We still don't know why it's in half. It looks like it went through the propeller, and that's possible. It could have also just been torn because the mounts never gave loose. And we look at the lifeboat number 2 from the port side, it split right where the rudder release system is. It ripped it clean off the boat. So when that stern section flipped upside down, it crushed on the surface. The stern section plows in and accordions 150 feet in the middle. All that cargo comes down, and the stern section flips over, and those lifeboats can only float up. They're filled with air tanks, and they're trying to get up, and they're ripping themselves to pieces trying to get up. And no guy ever makes it to either the life rafts or the lifeboats. We know that nothing was deployed inside them. So they know where it's at. It's somewhere between Crisp Point and Whitefish Point and Coppermine Point. It's 100 square miles to search, but they have a good fix on where they thought it was on radar. Well, how do you find an underwater object? Well, you call Illinois, the Navy, and you say, send your submarine detection airplane up here. So the Orion comes up. That stinger on the back is a magnetic anomaly detection device. So it goes over. Now, these are calibrated to find, at the time, the biggest Soviet submarines in the ocean. Those were these Delta III class, 450 feet long. What do you think happens when the Edmund Fitzgerald is 720 feet long, ripped into 2 pieces, spread 150 feet apart with taconite, 26,000 tons of iron ore? The metal detector on the plane goes wham like that when it comes over, and right away these guys come out. I got to interview all these guys. Being a television reporter was a great opportunity for me to capture not only the personalities of the people who are searching and really built the ship. This really became part of the documentary and eventually my book. But to see the personalities of these guys, the guy on the far left is the one that threw the smoke marker out the window, marked where the wreck was, and then the little tiny ship you see in the background right here is the Wood Rush. So Captain Hobaugh, who's also in my documentary, I got to interview him. He actually came to one of my lectures and was a co-lecture guy. Talk about an honor to have him there. This guy turns around, puts a big buoy on there, and Lake Superior that night gets big and wipes out the buoy. They can't find the ship again. They have to call the Navy again to have them come out and find the Edmund Fitzgerald again. So 2 different planes come out to find it. They find it, and the stern is upside down, the bow is right side up, and there's a huge pile of taconite behind the Edmund Fitzgerald. Why is that? How could it nosedive and have all of its belly contents behind it? It's impossible that it plowed in that way. It broke on the surface, and then it skidded off course and went right over its own pile, and then the bow section stayed on course but did not go nose first in. There's a lot of talk about furrows that people saw. I did not see furrows in front of the Edmund Fitzgerald. It went sideways into the bank, and the bank flew up on the top of the deck, so we can't even tell where hatches 7, 8, 9, 9's torn off, so that's the mid end of the section. But when we go into the underwater footage, we're going to really start to see what happened. See the first clamp, the Kessler clamp, is stretched out and sheared off? That one was dogged down. The ones that are all intact were all not dogged down. They were not tightened down. The smoking gun is down there on hatches 5, hatches 10. We know this to be a true fact. We know that this ship did not have all of their clamps down, and yet I still get 30 lectures every year. Somebody comes in and says, Rick, there's no sailor in the world that would go out without doing this. I assure you I have the biggest collection of Edmund Fitzgerald photographs anywhere and footage. And I show you this from 1975. Jerry had this on the internet going through the Sioux locks. Let's check it. All of these circles show undogged hatch clamps coming through the Sioux off of Lake Superior. And look at the top. On, off, on, off, on, off. Now the family members hate this because they think that I'm blaming the crew. They told Gordon in his song, I hate that you say the old hatch gave through, or the main hatchway gave in. It makes us feel bad. So he changed the lyrics. It did give way, but it wasn't the deckhand's fault. They were ordered not to do it. Now, would I have stayed on deck? I don't know if I would have gone out there and said, no, I think this is important. They'd gone to port and unloaded and never saw water inside. They thought their ship was infallible too. But there was enough scares that, it makes you wonder. So every picture, every storm I have, the Edmund Fitzgerald does not have all their hatches. The Coast Guard went aboard the sister ship of the Fitzgerald and found a tiny gap when they weren't down that they could see light through. And they calculated without the other damage, in 3 hours, that was enough water to sink the ship. So it did not help, but it did not sink it. The big storm sank the ship, but this did not help. And anytime somebody writes a new book and says it wasn't the hatches, you can tell them Rick says nonsense, and based it on the fact that I'm the only guy that's actually been there, right? So here, this is the topside deck looking at the starboard side of the Fitzgerald. Again, hatch number 1. There's a couple cool things to see here. I'll point out that the lounge windows are all in. This is where all the mucky mucks would stay, right? Outfitted by Hudson's. This was a first-class ship, but the covers are on. This is probably spring fit out, but I will tell you, in accordance with all of my hatch pictures, do you see hatch on, off, on, off, off? This is every picture, but again, this isn't fair because they're not sailing right now. They're probably at dock. Pre-1972, because it has the old style life raft on the top, we don't see the stack for the bow thruster either. That was put on in the 70s as well. So early picture, but a perfect view to show you. See the white marker down here? This is the bumper for the hatch crane that rides on that rail. Here's our mushroom cap vents to tighten down. These are still there because we could see all these, but it's buried in the mud on the other side. All of this stuff we're going to see in the movie underwater. The builder's plate right here that says built in River Rouge, Michigan. And look at this deck, forecastle deck. This has the guest quarters, captain's office, captain's bedroom up here. All this stuff right here is straight here, but watch when I go underwater. Look at this deck. That's from the impact of the bottom. Here's our bumper. I don't see the rail. Now, that could be buried in silt because the silt is relatively deep, but I don't think as deep as the rail. So here's something to ponder, something that's never been written in a book before. We have a rail gone. Was that the rail that they were talking of, the fence rail, or was it a rail here that tore off the vent? It could have happened. People have also blamed the propeller blades that were on deck after the ship, that those broke loose and that would cause the damage. More likely, there's a lot of flotsam and jetsam after a big storm. The Sioux locks were jammed up with logs and deadheads that came in from the lake. If you ever go to Whitefish Point after the winter, you can't walk the beach because of all the stumps and pieces of wood that are there, and that probably did the damage. But let's take a look at hatch number 1 together, shall we? It's caved in from that wave that came in. The lounge windows up above, the 20 feet higher, are all pushed inward from where that wave hit. Look at how deep that goes in there. Would a ship that nosedive and had 26,000 tons of tachonites that roll at 30 degrees, would that be empty? Would hatch 2 be empty if we had a nosedive ship? No, at least 10,000 tons would be in that first hold if the screen bulkheads held. But this doesn't have any of that damage. And when I first dove the Fitzgerald, I came across mud, and then flew up on the deck and realized I wasn't on the bottom of Lake Superior. I was on the top of the ship, but the mud was so thick from it flying up from hitting the bottom. and I saw this. The spar deck is ripped away from the ship, and I'm looking down into the tunnel. Where's the taconite? This would be jam-packed of a ship that nosedived in with 10,000 to 26,000 tons of taconite. Should be everywhere, and there's not a marble to be seen. This is easily good excuse to say there's no way it nosedived. Look at the hill, too, that comes down. Seeing this name was so just haunting. It filled the porthole of a submarine. It falls off to about the 17th-foot plimsoll mark, meaning the Fitzgerald plowed into the mud till it hit bedrock. And when it hit bedrock, everything stopped. So all the stuff in the pilot house, the ceiling collapsed. It all came to the port side of the ship, and it's all littered in the thing. You cannot see anything inside there. It's all covered with debris. So the dives went from 76, the Coast Guard, to Jacques Cousteau, to 89, to our dive in 94. And to try to put together a documentary getting all those pieces, impossible. I called the Cousteau Society, and they looked at me and said, we're not going to help you. Now, what does that do to an investigative reporter like me? I'm like, oh, yeah? Well, watch this. So I find out that Westinghouse did a whole bunch of surveys on the Soucoupe, and I found footage of this. I found interviews with all the people who wouldn't talk to me and put together this documentary. So when you watch this piece that talks about it, think about all the pieces of people that didn't want to be in the documentary that made it. Also, in our dive in 94, our dive, I was the third dive, and we go down. Remember, no one had ever seen a person on the shipwreck. And our instructions from the Canada Ministry, which we believed the wreck at the time, was all in Canadian waters. They said, you can't put any camera in the window, you can't put any camera in the porthole, and guess what? We were fine with that. I didn't want to see a body on the Edmund Fitzgerald. We assumed all 29 were entombed inside, and God bless them, they were there. But it didn't work out that way. I dove, I got lost after I did the bow section, got to the back section, hatch 8 and 9, no cargo there at all. This is where that should be all piled up from where it broke at the section and then collapsed in. No cargo at the back of the front section that's upright. We get lost, we come back, I finally radio up, please give me more time, I want to see the stern. I want to see if there's a scrape to see if it ran aground, like everybody had said. They gave me permission, but they said, come back up. The tug owner and his son want to go for a ride. And they were going to get a deal because we were paying for this out of pocket. Fred Shannon took his wife's dream home, $75,000, and took that and gambled it by renting the submarine and the tugboat. So we hoped that we'd get a deal. And of course, the tug owner goes, my boy wants to write a middle school report on the Edmund Fitzgerald. You're going to get an A, right? If you write it, you go down in a submarine. The tragedy is that kid was, as soon as I came up after seeing the stern section, 20 minutes later, this kid goes down and finds the first missing crewman on the Edmund Fitzgerald. Watch in this video how he handles this and tell me he was not the best guy in our entire team to see this.
Only a handful of explorers have gained permission to dive the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, located over 500 feet down in Lake Superior's icy water. In 1976, the Coast Guard lowered the Curve 3, a special remote-operated vehicle that could record video and snap pictures. It revealed that the Fitz was ripped into two main sections, the bow upright, the stern upside down. In 1980, Jacques Cousteau's team were the first humans to dive down to the wreck, exploring the bow section and reporting extensive damage that they believed was caused by a surface breakup. 9 years later, Whitefish Point led a team with a 3D camera to explore the site remotely. An open door was found in the pilot house, leading some to believe it was an escape attempt as the Fitz made its final plunge. In 1994, submersibles again visited the wreck. In early July, Harbor Branch Oceanographic sent several teams down in the Clelia, and only a few weeks later, the Delta looked for clues. At the end of the first day of diving, the Delta subcrew found a sailor's body lying on the lake bottom near the bow section.
So quiet and dark down there. It reminds me of a church, is knowing that God's down there.
It's quiet where they sleep, no more the tempest to roar.
Headlines were quick to admonish the team, and the state of Michigan passed a law banning the use of footage taken. A final dive with the Canadian Navy removed the ship's bell, and many family members of the lost crew called for a ban on diving the Edmund Fitzgerald. A later deepwater sonar scan revealed what appeared to be substantial damage to the spar deck of the Fitz. a teasing clue to a shipwreck that still largely remains a mystery some 40 years later.
You know, when you go to do these stories, especially as a news person, I was part of a news crew that went, you don't go to be part of the story, but it was thrown into our laps that the Coast Guard had missed this, Whitefish Point had missed this, Jacques Cousteau's team had missed this, and instantly we had it. What do? We can't ignore it. We have to, you know, this is a news story, and it made as many headlines as when the Edmund Fitzgerald was lost, that we found it. We never identified the guy, even though we did close-ups and we all knew who it was. We're not going to tell people because that's not what we are. The song was Lake Superior never gives up its dead. That was the mystery, and the lake had given up part of its mystery on this. Now, it wasn't a Chippewa legend like Gordon's saying, all right? There's no Chippewa legend about Lake Superior. That's a Lake Tahoe legend, by the way, and Native American. All in my book. There's a brand new book out too from John Bacon. Fantastic look at what's happened to the crew members since then. But there's a danger when you go in and you start interviewing the people who lost loved ones. They put certain restrictions on what you can talk about and what you can't. They won't talk about the body story because it brings bad feelings to them, and I understand that. As a news person, you can't let that cloud what the story is. You don't leave stuff out that makes people feel bad. That's what Gordon did. He changed his song. At 7 p.m., a main hatchway gave in when he came to sing it in Saginaw. He goes, at 7 p.m., it grew dark in then, and I was mad. And everybody's looking at me, why are you so bothered by this? I said, because why didn't you change Fully Loaded for Cleveland? You know, why did he also changed Musty Old Church in Detroit. Thank God, because he shows up at Mariners Church, and of course it's not musty. It's a beautiful little church. And I'm sure they were looking, Father Ingalls looking at him like, dude, really? You know? So he did change that part as well. But to me, if you're going to have this record, and again, he is now the patron saint of shipwrecks. I would not be talking to you about shipwrecks or any other maritime history if it wasn't for Gordon Lightfoot. So I say a lot of this with a very big smile on my face to say, thank God he did. The lyric, does anyone know where the love of God goes when the waves turn to minutes to hours? It's pure poetry, and my arm's hair still stands up. So his song is fantastic. This is our dive. The plaque going down, this is before the bell came up, and we put a plaque down there, the first to memorialize the crew. So at the 10th hatch is a list of the names of the guys, and at the bottom of that list is a list of the crew that were down there. So my name is at the bottom of the 10th hatch, and I don't believe I belong there, but if I've been put into this story, and I'm probably the most sought after interview for the ship because of what I've seen and what I've done, but it's sobering to think that. And in every interview you hear from me is it's a roller coaster of total sadness when we find a body to total exhilaration from diving the most famous shipwreck in the Great Lakes. And that's really what it's become for me. Go to Shipwreck Podcast and you'll find out that there's more shipwrecks than just the Edmund Fitzgerald. It turns out that we had a storm in 1913. In fact, the Fitzgerald storm wasn't even in the top 12 of the worst storms on the Great Lakes. And I say that not in any indifference to the 29 that were lost. Nobody gets more bells rung or lights shown for them than those crew. But there's 25,000 other people who lost their lives. 260 in 1913 alone. The winds were twice the velocity on the 1940 Armistice Day storm. And when they asked Captain Cooper, who came off of Lake Superior, was that a bad storm? He was, oh no, I was on Lake Michigan during the Armistice Day storm. That's a bad storm. That's when one ship was ripped into pieces, the crew killed, the Davik flipped upside down, Detroit captain, all the crew wiped out. We didn't know what happened to that for almost 50 years until we finally dove it. The Novadoc, I got to interview the crew. They're in the documentary Final Run. That's all, I think, stories that people who didn't get a song by Gordon Lightfoot. And I think that we deserve to ring that bell for them, too, as well. And that's what I'll stand up for. I'll leave it there, though. Do you have any questions for me? I think you had leading questions, didn't you?
Well, actually, well, first of all, thank you. That was amazing. I think we're just going to open it up to the audience. Please raise your hand and give the docents a moment to bring a microphone over to you so that everybody can hear you both in here and on the live stream.
One in the back over here. We're waiting because we do have a live stream audience. And hello to the audience. Live stream, there's over 200 people that are watching right now. So it's fantastic to extend it to that size. You're very welcome. Thank you for coming. And also, if you'd like, the books are $20, the videos are $20. My wife said any 3 for $50 because she loves Bentley Library that much. So I'm thrilled that we can provide this story, and a different story than what John did. I think you'll find them to be companions because he does go into the incredible families. I stay away from it for the very reasons I told you, and because Bob Hemming wrote a book about the families too that was great. Yes, in the back.
Thank you for an outstanding talk, fascinating. One thing I wanted to ask is, because I couldn't put it together myself, although you're very, very thorough, usually when major disasters happen, it's a coincidence of many small things going wrong. Is that, would you say that's what happened here, or was there one, a major smoking gun that could have been, prevented it, like a captain that was more forthright or didn't have the pressures of incentives? I'm very interested.
If you look at the list of how many storms McSorley went through just in 1975, and the fact that he got damage from all of those storms in some way, that is a clear indication of a captain that either didn't care or really believed that ship could take it. And I'd like to believe that because he wanted to go home. His wife was sick. I don't think that he was blatantly crazy, but structural issues with the ship are fact. We have Coast Guard reports that showed that the keel had problems in big storms. They thought it had been fixed though. But after all those other storms and the ship that came through the most, add in now missing vents, water pouring in that the captain reported. There's no question that Lake Superior was pouring into that ship. And then those hatches, 21 hatches with just a minor tiny gap that had enough water coming in there that they couldn't pump out because the cargo was jammed into the rose box, and the only pump was aft of the ship. So if that ship was leaning forward, the pumps couldn't even take out, despite the fact that there's 26,000 tons of marbles blocking the water from coming out. A whole series of problems. But that's why the Anderson didn't sink. It wasn't 3 giant waves, the 3 sisters, because that would have killed the Anderson. It was a series of things, but it was that big wave that took her out. She would have sailed all the way to Whitefish if it wasn't for that big wave. I'm confident of that. But the big wave was enough, but she would have shook it off if she hadn't all those other issues.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, question right behind, if you don't mind. Yeah.
Did any of the myths around the sinking or the analysis of the accident change the way ships are designed or operated?
That's a great question. Did the report from the Coast Guard, which immediately Coast Guard says, you're going to carry less cargo in the winter. We thought these hatches were better, so we're going to cut you by billions of dollars. You can't carry as much cargo in the winter. Then they said, we're going to put steel bulkheads in all the ships too. This is our recommendation. And the ship owners said, no, we have tunnels cut into those so the bulldozers can push the cargo out. We can turn around the ship faster if we don't have watertight bulkheads. They ignored all of the stuff the Coast Guard said, and they said it ran aground at Caribou, and you can't prove it. So the Coast Guard came out and said, well, we think it might be hatch covers, but we don't know. And even one of their board members said, yeah, we don't think so. It was almost a travesty from that. But go 5 years from now, right away, Senator Rupee comes out and says, we need a network of buoys that can report in the wave heights faster than the ships can, so we can give the meteorologists a tool. We had one satellite flying that was horribly low res, couldn't help out anything. It would take 50 years before we got high-res GO satellites and the weather satellites too. The buoy system was turned down by the government immediately. They put one out on Lake Michigan, and it took 10 years before we got it. The suits that you put on to protect you, the ocean had them for years. They had rubber suits since World War II. It took 10 years before they mandated them on ships. And we didn't see lifeboats that would launch from the deck of a ship until, I think, 15 years after the Fitzgerald went down. So not much happened in the shipping company, but here's what the Coast Guard did. Surprise inspections. They'd jump on your ship and go, let's see if you're battening down your hatches. 80% of the ships that they surprised were non-compliant. And within 6 months, all of a sudden, all the hatches were going back on. So that combined into, they stopped doing the ride-aboard program almost a year afterwards because everybody was back to keeping their ships watertight. That and the fact that these guys sailed over the top of the Edmund Fitzgerald as a constant reminder to be careful. And this guy that sang a song in Canada that would play on the radio, forgive me, the captain on board the Wolverine, when I sailed with him, we went out and I said, hey, did you ever hear that song? He goes, that damn song. And he rolls his eyes. They hated that song for the longest time, and so did the families, because they thought Gordon was making millions off of it. But Gordon started inviting them to the concerts, and they became very close. Pam Johnson is a very close friend. The cook that passed away is her dad, and she was just devastated when Gordon passed away. They were very close, and that's why that song got changed, was because of that closeness that they had. But those changes, it took a long time. It's sad to think that, but I think it's the constant reminder of going over the Fitz graves, because we don't see that. Every 9 years we lost another big ship. We still have big accidents. The brand new Coast Guard cutter that hit the wall, we had a 1,000-footer get hit by a brand new Coast Guard cutter, the Hollyhock. The 1,000-footer, the biggest one, Paul Tregurtha, ran aground and blocked the river system for a while. It still happens, but thank God not a catastrophe where we lose 29 people. Yeah. I can repeat it too if you want.
Thank you. As a sailor on the Great Lakes, I'm fascinated and terrified by this rogue wave. And
yeah.
My question is it a singular event that's big in a storm of otherwise big waves, or are there a succession of them, or how do they form? And
every storm is different, and every saltwater captain on board Coast Guard cutters, like Captain Hobaugh that came, Captain Muth that I talked to that saved the guys on the Bradley, I flew him back when we broke ice on board the Sundew for the last time. These guys all told me the ocean was predictable. You would pitch and yaw, and you didn't have a problem, because the Great Lakes, it bounces off the coastline, and you pitch and yaw at the same time, and it scared the heck out of them. So it is different. And many people go, well, there's 3 sisters, or there's a series of this. If we really had it down to a science, we'd go 1, 2, 3, turn, and go into the wave. We don't. And unfortunately now, the only best thing is to look at the forecast and then park your ship. We have 12,000 footers now that do most of the iron ore cargo on the Great Lakes. We have smaller vessels that'll take it into the river systems and stuff. But those ships are much bigger than the Fitzgerald. They can do 70,000 tons in one load. If it's a 10-foot wave, they park and they wait. And that's largely because of the storm, and it's largely because there's not a big enough steel industry. Remember the difference between 1975 and now, the foreign competition from China and stuff now. Maybe with the tariffs we'll see ships come out. A lot of us are praying that the Anderson will come back in, and come back out for another career, but I gotta believe she's done. I think that they're just nervous to announce it during the 50th anniversary of the Edmund Fitzgerald loss. So I hope they do something, but people tell me, let's make it into a museum ship. And I'm like, we've got 7 beautiful museum ships that nobody goes to see. How many people have been to the Schoonmaker in Toledo? How many people have seen the Irwin in Duluth, the lightship in Huron? Excellent. Lightship in Huron, a must. How about the Mather in Cleveland? We got to go. You got to support these. And I'll tell you this, our museums, our libraries are in jeopardy right now. There's this misconception that we're going to have everything online someday and we won't need them. Individual libraries like Bentley are repositories for local history. And more importantly, the minds that have been here, they store their information. There's even, God help me, a Mixter file here now. It's amazing to think that we have these resources and they'll never all be online. Bay County's museum at one time almost lost their museum by 200 votes. It's up to you to protect these resources by showing up at these talks, by going to the resources, the individual tiny libraries and the mega wonderful, academic libraries as well. We have to protect these resources. I need them. I can't tell my stories without them. I cannot just go on the internet and type in this, although it's a lot easier to search the newspapers now. I could do 5 million newspapers like this. Another question before we wrap up? Yeah.
Yeah, and I need these museums to stay open too, as director of this one that we're in right now. But We have one question online. With regards to the safety changes that you mentioned, Rick, do you believe that they are sufficient to prevent another disaster like the Fitzgerald, or do you think it could happen again?
I think that it's a wonderful compromise. We cannot say we're going to be safe. People look at my career and they go, you flew an F-16, you jump out of airplanes, you dove the Edmund Fitzgerald. What's the most dangerous thing you've ever done? That's easy. Driving on the Lodge in Detroit is by far the most dangerous thing I ever do. When I'm doing 55 and they're doing 100 past me, that's way safer than putting my gear on and going to a schooner that's 180 feet down. So to me, we all have risks. We all mitigate those risks, and we try to make it as safe as we can, and that's what the shipping industry has done. But for us to fool ourselves into thinking that Mother Nature can't make a storm to sink even a 1,000-foot ship is ludicrous. It will happen, and complacency is what causes this. When we all start to go, I'm too big. You know, the rumor was always Titanic was unsinkable. They never really said that. That was only after it sank. But that was the mind thought, you know, was how could it ever sink? And that's what happened. They went full speed through essentially a minefield, you know, through an ice field and sank themselves. So we mustn't be complacent, even with the laws that are in there. And the laws are formed not only to protect the industry, but also to make sure the industry can still work, because we can't just haul 5 pellets at a time and make it safe. Up in the middle. We do no can time. I don't mean to. Oh, awesome.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It's awesome. My question is, like probably a lot of people, most of your maritime wreck reference points is the Titanic, some of your larger, you know, passenger ships. And those seem to take a while to sink even after they've encountered their death knell. And my question is, I have a hard time wrapping my head around how quickly the Edmund Fitzgerald went down, and there was no time for an SOS, no time to launch boats, you know, there was nothing. Can you kind of fill in some of those details as to like sequence of events and timing? And
you bet. For people who didn't hear, why was it so quick? What happened on the Fitzgerald that's different? Every iron ore ship that we found on the bottom is usually destroyed. And the Whitefish Point Museum, when you visit our museum, that money goes back into our dive boat, the Boyd, and we go out and we found over 20 new shipwrecks over the last 4 years. So if you watch National Geographic, you'll see me on there when we find the lumber fleet of Edward Hines, the Marvin and the Curtis, and we're still looking for the Peterson. The wood boats would float gently down to the bottom and give you plenty of time, although everybody sadly perished trying to get to the lifeboats, we think. Iron ore boats go down so quick because they're filled with rocks. And it's just so quick, and it doesn't have the compartments like a passenger ship would. So in the Titanic, watertight areas that sadly overflowed and dumped into the next one, and that caused a problem. Fitzgerald didn't have that. So as that water's getting them lower and lower and lower in the water, that wave comes up and hits. Now the no call for help was probably because that bow section, there's a lip on the back of the 8th hatch, 9th hatch. I think that flipped the bow up, and I think those guys were all thrown to the back and they couldn't recover from it. I don't think it nosedived and the windows blew out and that was the end of it. There's still glass in the back of some of the windows, so it feels like that probably happened. With the person that we found on the bow section, they had a life jacket on. That means they probably had an indication. You don't go on a ship and go next to the captain and put your life jacket on. It sends him a very clear indication that you don't believe he's going to make it, right? You wait for the order to do that, or you quietly do it in your bedroom or away from the pilot house. So if he was on the pilot house and the captain ordered it, he had a little more, worry than what he said, we're holding our own. So it was fast, but it could have been 10 minutes too. If that ship tipped upward, they couldn't get to the radio. That's the only radios were in the forward section. Everybody else in the stern section, God forbid, took a section to flip over upside down, and hopefully it was quick, that it was just over with. And that's the only solace that I get, is that it was over. These guys that get on life rafts for 2 nights waiting for a ship to go by, that's horrible. It's bad to die on a shipwreck, but to sit there and wait for someone to come that never does, that's even worse, and that's many of the other stories that we tell. So I think that's what it is, but we won't know till we dive the shipwreck. And it's been 50 years since it sank. The question is, should we be able to go back? ethically, there's people who are upset about that, and I understand that. But we don't get places where, like 9/11, where the families say you can't go there. You know, the Fitzgerald families have a lot of voice in this, and it's because there's intact bodies there. But there's intact bodies on the Kamloops and the Emperor. There's several different shipwrecks. Most of the shipwrecks have bodies on them. We're mostly respectful about it. And the Fitzgerald was a different story, too. 29 vanished. Everybody wondered where they went. We showed where one went. I think it was different. When we dove the Bradley, they were all upset. You're going to show bodies. We don't care about the bodies. But there wasn't a song about, you know, Lake Superior never giving up. It's dead. So it's ethics, but it's also what we deal with every day as gatekeepers of what information is released. And sometimes we get it right. Sometimes we get it wrong. And now with 24-hour news cycles, they're getting it wrong a lot because that decision is made faster and faster and faster, and quite frankly, why I got out of news. You've been amazing. Thank you, everybody, for coming out.
So, thank you all for joining us this evening. Thanks as well to Greg Parker, Director of the Detroit Observatory, for monitoring the live stream, and to our wonderful Michigan media team for recording our session. Everybody who registered, you'll receive an email sometime in the next week or so with a link to this video so you can share it, watch it again, you know, delete it and never think about it again, whatever you'd like. Our next Making Michigan will be on December 11th when Professor Laura Hirschburn will join us to discuss the history of U of M Psychiatric Hospital. And for those of you here in the observatory this evening, the original observatory upstairs will be open till about 8 for tours to see the original 19th century telescopes. We have some really incredible student docents who are both sides of the room here who can tell you all the important and exciting things about it that I don't know. I highly encourage you to take a look if you have the time. I don't know if we'll be using the telescope tonight. Probably not, it's a bit cloudy. But for those of you attending virtually, we hope you'll be able to visit us soon. We're open Thursday and Friday afternoons, Friday evenings for viewing nights, and on certain Saturdays. Thank you again for joining us, and all have a wonderful night.
We've got books up here if you'd like.